January 7, 1945. Supreme Headquarters, Allied Expeditionary Force, Versailles. Eisenhower's office was colder than the winter winds that scoured the French countryside. Snow pressed against the windows like frozen fingers, and the light of the afternoon sun was dim and gray, reflecting off the ice-coated rooftops outside. He sat alone at his desk, a transcript spread before him that had arrived only an hour earlier for Belgium. The words on the page should have been routine, a simple field marshal briefing reporters. Yet they were anything but routine. His hands, gripping the paper, trembled slightly. They gripped harder than necessary, knuckles pale, as if the act of holding the document could somehow absorb the threat it contained. 3 years of painstaking coalition warfare, 3 years of patience, compromise, and delicate political navigation had brought him to this moment. Every decision he had made carried the weight of 2 nations, 2 armies, and 2 very different philosophies about victory. And now, in this quiet office, something fragile had been shattered. A pen rested on the desk, untouched. A draft cable to General George Marshall in Washington remained unwritten. And yet, Eisenhower's mind had already formed the decision. It was cold, final, unyielding, like the snow falling silently outside. Something was about to break, not in the forests of Belgium, but in the alliance itself. Not on the battlefield, but in the war of personalities and power that had defined coalition leadership. 7 hours earlier, in Belgium, Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stood before a cluster of journalists and cameras at Zavin. His maroon beret was perched neatly over one eye, the harness of his parachute draped across his shoulders, a figure of military authority. His chief of intelligence, Brigadier Williams, had begged him not to hold the press conference. "It is unwise," Williams warned. "It will provoke anger, misunderstandings. Please reconsider." Alan Moorhead, the correspondent, had pleaded with Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Gingand, to intervene. "He will make a mistake," Moorhead had said, his voice edged with frustration. De Gingand had tried to persuade the field marshal, to no avail. Montgomery would not be deterred. Now, under the flash of cameras, Montgomery spoke for over an hour without notes, narrating the unfolding of the Battle of the Bulge. His words were measured, confident, delivered with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. He praised the American soldier. He referred to Eisenhower as the captain of the team, a gesture that seemed, at first glance, honorable. Yet the phrasing, the tone, the very structure of his statements did something far more dangerous than any battlefield maneuver. They reframed the narrative. In Montgomery's telling, the Americans had stumbled, faltered, been outmatched, and he alone had brought order and clarity. He compared the German retreat to his triumph at El Alamein in 1942, drawing a line from the deserts of Egypt to the frozen Ardennes. "Please reconsider." Alan Moorhead, the correspondent, had pleaded with Montgomery's chief of staff, Major General Freddie de Gingand, to intervene. "He will make a mistake," Moorhead had said, his voice edged with frustration. De Gingand had tried to persuade the field marshal, to no avail. Montgomery would not be deterred. Churchill repeatedly intervened to save his most famous general from his own ambition. Eisenhower had always protected him, always smoothed over insults, always kept the coalition intact. Until now, December 16th, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, 24 German divisions, 10 of them armored, smashed into the Ardennes forest. The offensive carved a deep bulge in General Omar Bradley's 12th Army Group. His 1st and 9th Armies, positioned to the north, lost contact with headquarters to the south. Communications collapsed entirely. The bulge widened, threatening to reach the Meuse River. Eisenhower faced a decision of unparalleled gravity. The 1st and 9th Armies, some 200,000 American troops, had to be temporarily placed under Montgomery's command. Purely military logic dictated unity of command during the crisis. For Bradley, it felt humiliating. For Lieutenant General George Patton, it bordered on treachery. Both men obeyed, expecting Montgomery to act as a steward, respecting American command structures. Instead, Montgomery arrived at First Army headquarters like a feudal lord inspecting the failures of his vassals. He rejected defensive plans outright, reordered lines, halted counterattacks, and proceeded to lecture exhausted American generals on what he considered elementary tactics. "I shall tidy up this mess," he reportedly said. The phrase seared itself into the collective memory of the American officer corps. While Montgomery did stabilize the northern shoulder, his manner destroyed every remaining thread of goodwill. American officers began discussing, almost openly, whether they would rather fight the Germans than their British allies. Montgomery, oblivious, mistook their silence for agreement and their discipline for submission. He believed he had proven his indispensability. January 7th, 1945, in the afternoon, Eisenhower read Montgomery's press conference transcript a second time, and then a third. The heroic defense of Bastogne by the 101st Airborne Division was barely mentioned. 19,000 Americans had died in the Ardennes. Montgomery described it as one of the most interesting and tricky battles I have ever handled, trivializing American sacrifice while claiming personal credit. The telephone calls began almost immediately. Bradley warned he would resign rather than serve under Montgomery again. "I cannot take this," he said, voice tight with anger. Patton demanded to be unleashed, ready to strike German positions despite orders. The American command structure threatened to fracture entirely. Eisenhower had spent 3 years mediating, compromising, placing coalition unity above personal pride. But there were lines even a coalition general could not allow to be crossed. Montgomery had publicly humiliated the army Eisenhower commanded and threatened the fragile political stability that kept British and American forces working together. Eisenhower reached for the paper. At last, the pen moved. In late December, before the crisis escalated further, Montgomery had been demanding supreme ground command for months. His letters to London criticized American competence. His cables to Eisenhower bordered on insubordination. By December 30th, Eisenhower had reached the limit of his patience. He drafted a message, not addressed to Montgomery directly, but sent to the combined chiefs of staff through General Marshal. Its language was cold, precise, and devastating. He described an unbridgeable gulf between Supreme Headquarters and the 21st Army Group, declaring the command structure unworkable. He presented the chiefs with an impossible choice: Montgomery or himself. One had to go. When Major General Freddie de Guingand arrived at Eisenhower's headquarters that day, the draft in hand, his face turned pale. He understood immediately what Montgomery had failed to grasp. Eisenhower was not bluffing. The combined chiefs would side with the Supreme Commander over the brilliant but obstinate Field Marshal. De Guingand begged Eisenhower for 48 hours before sending the message. Eisenhower consented. The cable remained unsent, but its mere existence signaled the gravity of the situation. De Guingand drove, through blizzard conditions, to Montgomery's headquarters. He found the Field Marshal in high spirits, convinced of the press conference's success, certain that he was untouchable. Evening of January 7th, 1945. The press conference had transformed the earlier December crisis into mere rehearsal. Eisenhower drafted a new message to Marshal, simpler, more final. The choice remained the same. He showed the draft to de Guingand, who had returned in haste. Reading the words, de Guingand realized that Montgomery had crossed a line from which there could be no return. No apology could repair the damage. No clarification would undo the humiliation. The American command structure teetered on revolt. Eisenhower had to choose between protecting his army and shielding a difficult ally. The document required only Eisenhower's signature to remove Britain's most famous general from command. Harold Alexander, strategically competent yet diplomatically limited, had already been suggested as Montgomery's replacement. Eisenhower set down his pen. "Show this to Montgomery," he instructed de Guingand. "Let him grasp where he stood." The ultimatum was unspoken, yet absolute: silence or dismissal. De Guingand arrived near midnight. Montgomery remained cheerful, convinced the press conference had gone well, convinced of his untouchability. De Guingand did not waste time. He described the contents of Eisenhower's draft, outlined the fury of American generals, and explained that even Churchill could not save him this time. "Ike is going to fire you," he said. For a moment, Montgomery laughed. "Impossible," he muttered. "They need me." Eisenhower would never dare. Then de Gingan described the cold precision of Eisenhower's language, the mention of Harold Alexander as replacement, and reality struck. Montgomery's smile vanished. He slumped into his chair, older than his 57 years, the weight of miscalculation settling like a physical blow. The indispensable man had misjudged the situation. He was no longer negotiating with a politician, but with the most powerful military commander in the Western world. The silence in the tactical trailer was absolute. The following morning, January 8th, 1945, a letter arrived on Eisenhower's desk, written in Montgomery's own hand. The tone was unrecognizable. No demands, no lectures, no advice, only abject apology. Whatever Eisenhower's decision, Montgomery promised compliance. The signature read, "Your very devoted subordinate, Monty." It was the most humiliating document Montgomery had ever signed, a complete surrender from a man who had never surrendered to anyone. Eisenhower read it without emotion, acknowledging it with a terse acceptance. The crisis ended. The alliance endured. Their friendship, however, had been irrevocably broken. From January 1945 through May 1945, Montgomery remained in command, but everything had changed. Eisenhower never trusted him again. Their relationship became strictly functional. When operations resumed, Eisenhower relied heavily on Bradley, giving American forces the lead in the final push into Germany. Montgomery staged elaborate northern operations, but Eisenhower ensured American forces crossed the Rhine first, taking the glory Montgomery had assumed was his. The shut up or get out moment defined the remainder of the campaign. Montgomery retained rank and honors, later becoming Viscount Montgomery of Alamein, yet his influence was diminished. The baton of global power had passed decisively from Britain to the United States. Churchill privately acknowledged the truth. Montgomery had nearly jeopardized everything. Montgomery later wrote in his memoirs, "So great was the feeling against me on the part of the American generals that whatever I said was bound to be wrong. I should therefore have said nothing." Eisenhower's assessment was far colder. The resentment and contempt of the American commanders was deep and enduring, and Montgomery never fully grasped it. On May 4th, 1945, Montgomery formally accepted the German surrender in Northern Europe. On May 8th, victory came. Photographs captured Eisenhower and Montgomery side by side, a tableau of Allied unity. Behind the cameras, the distance between them was absolute. Montgomery kept his stars and public acclaim, but he had been neutralized in the corridors of power. He had won battles, but lost the respect of those who mattered most. He could move divisions and plan operations, but he had forgotten the fundamental rule. In coalition warfare, dignity was as vital as divisions. The pen had proved mightier than the sword. Eisenhower's restraint proved deadlier than any confrontation. Montgomery had believed himself indispensable. Eisenhower had proven otherwise. The snow eventually melted in the Ardennes. Victory was achieved. The alliance endured. The frost between Eisenhower and Montgomery, however, never thawed. Their collaboration continued only because the war required it, not because trust had returned. The press conference of January 7th, 1945, had cost Montgomery more than he could have imagined. Not his career, but his voice, his influence, and the respect of the men who truly mattered. The battle in the Ardennes had been fought on frozen ground, but the most decisive battle was fought in a warm office with pen and paper. The decisive victory was not tactical, but moral, political, and absolute.